Now it's getting wild, the asset manager, when X talks about his US dollar Bitcoin target, or his $3 million Bitcoin target doesn't sound that special at first. Fred Krueger adds to the mix with his latest theory, which is a 7-year Giga Bitcoin cycle. We all know the drill. There are 3 positive years, 1 negative, 3 positives, 1 negative. And we've often seen that people have timed the cycles here to massively outperform Bitcoin, or rather, to take advantage of Bitcoin's cyclical movement. Sell at the top, buy at the bottom, sell at the top, buy at the bottom, and so on. And now there are 2 new statements, one from VanEck and one from Fred Krueger, both of whom have analyzed the Bitcoin cycles and come to their conclusions.
Because Fred Krueger warns that many people are caught off guard. Look, I'm here on the beach in L. How cool, here at sunset. The warning is definitely that many will get caught off guard because they'll sell their Bitcoin in 2026, thinking the cycles always repeat, and then they'll sell their Bitcoin at the top. But he is quite certain that there will never be such a blatant drawback again. And that's why he's clearly warning about the Bitcoin Giga Cycle. Now, let's take a look at the different statements from Fred Krueger, as these are 2 opposing theories. One side says, hey, we have recurring cycles, while the other side says, no, we don't have recurring cycles, we're going straight into the Giga Cycle. I'm still a bit skeptical. There are those who say, hey, we have recurring cycles, and there are those who say, hey, no, we don't have recurring cycles, but we are now going straight into the Giga Cycle.
I'll give you a heads up right away as a spoiler. I'm still a bit skeptical because we've seen time and again in bull markets that eventually the super cycle gets called out, the Giga Cycle or whatever, and then it's just like Bitcoin is going to the moon. But these reasons are really interesting, so take a look. Before we get to Fred Krueger's reasoning for the Giga Cycle, let's quickly touch on what VanEck is predicting, because that's important for putting everything into context later.
What's your take on this asset?
Let's say over the next 12 months. Sure. When we look at previous cycles, the pattern becomes really clear. Bitcoin outperforms everything else for 3 out of 4 years. And then in that 4th year, there tends to be a big drop, like 60 to 80%. And that down year is usually the 2nd year after the halving, so the Bitcoin halving happened in April of this year. So I think 2024 is going to be a strong year, and 2025 should be strong too. But unless something changes, I think 2026 will be a down year. And when we look at the trough to the peak in each of those 4-year cycles, each cycle gets a little bit smaller. The smallest ever trough to peak appreciation for Bitcoin was 2,000%. So let's say we cut that in half and say it's going to be 1,000% this year, or 1,000% this cycle. Bitcoin troughed around 18,000, so I see an upside to 180,000 this cycle, and I think that's likely to happen next year. So it's a really volatile asset. We can overshoot on the upside or the downside, but I'm looking at that technical backdrop, and we're checking out a bunch of what we call topping indicators to really see when the red light is flashing.
And this is interesting. This isn't the Giga Cycle prediction we'll look at later. This is just the standard prediction you keep hearing. She says that, again, 3 positive years, negative year, which means next year will be massive again, because VanEck, one of the largest asset managers who also have a Bitcoin ETF here, expects a negative year here in 2026. Now, very importantly, he says that the worst cycle so far for Bitcoin from bottom to top was 2,000%, and he is now simply assuming in his price projection, because he simply wants to remain conservative here, that he will deduct half here because we simply tend to have diminishing returns, which means that the returns are getting smaller and smaller. In 2001, we saw the early gains initially were higher than in the last. Now he's starting from 2,000% and saying Bitcoin will do only % this year. He predicts a US dollar target for next year. He mentions key indicators to signal the peak. That means he's coming up with a price target of US dollars, and we'll see those US dollars next year. He also talks about a few top indicators that need to trigger to signal the peak. There are different things like, for example, Google Trends, Google search queries, or, for example, realized market capitalization. So here are the realized gains from the holders. If there's a high realization rate for profits, then that's also a top indicator. He mentioned 3 or 4 more indicators, but that's not super important right now. The important takeaway here is that we're still very far from those top indicators, meaning they haven't triggered yet, and that's why he's being conservative with the US dollar projection.
Now, pay attention. In the next cycle, this projection leads to a price of US dollars, and at some point, Bitcoin will break through the gold market cap. If we have a world that's heavily Bitcoinized and Bitcoin establishes itself as a reserve asset, then VanEck even predicts a price of $3 million for Bitcoin.
That's basically the normal scenario. Now, pay attention, he also has an escalation scenario, and after that, we'll take a look at the Giga Cycle.
Well, going back to game theory, when we have other countries considering creating Bitcoin strategic reserves, and we've heard such bullish talk from President Trump, is it possible that if they decide to take action, Bitcoin could just skyrocket and hit, I don't know, 7 figures in the next 2 years? It's always possible because the supply is really limited.
So, if gold demand shot up tenfold over the next year, suddenly there'd be a lot more gold available in the supply. I think China just announced they found $1 trillion gold reserve. El Salvador is talking about $1 trillion gold reserves, and it costs a lot of money to dig that stuff out of the ground. Often higher prices are the catalyst to make it affordable. Bitcoin's not like that. A tenfold increase is beyond expectations. He discusses, our target is around US dollars, but if the US creates a Bitcoin reserve, it could hit 1 million next year. If gold demand rises, mine more or sell jewelry back into fiat.
Now he's talking about the absolute escalation scenario and says, our price target is around US dollars, but if the US creates a Bitcoin reserve, then Bitcoin could hit 1 million next year. If gold demand rises, more gold can be mined. You dig deeper or you go to space. Higher gold prices increase commodity prices and supply incentives. When the demand for gold goes up, you can mine more gold. You dig deeper or you go to space or whatever, you could even sell grandma's gold jewelry and trade it back into fiat money or whatever. So the higher the gold price goes, the higher the price of a commodity rises, and that creates more incentive to expand the supply. And exactly this can't happen with Bitcoin. And that's why you get these wild price predictions sometimes, even from people like Max Kaiser or Samson Moe, who say, okay, conservatively 180, but hey, there's nothing stopping Bitcoin from hitting 1 million next year. I see it just as critically. So I don't see Bitcoin hitting 1 million next year, but if we have a Bitcoin reserve strategy and global FOMO kicks in, that's definitely not out of the question. Is the probability 100? No. Is the probability 0? No. Is the probability 0? No, but the probability is somewhere around 10% or something like that. Now we delve into the Giga Cycle story, which was the conservative projection, 3 positive years, 1 negative. Unless escalation scenarios occur, then it could break through. Now, we have a different approach and perspective on Bitcoin, which Fred Krueger shares as he discusses the Bitcoin Giga Cycle. If we have such escalation scenarios, then it is possible that the whole thing will break down here. But now we also have a completely different approach, a whole different perspective on Bitcoin, and that's what Fred Krueger shares with us as he talks about the Bitcoin Giga Cycle.
I think we'll totally stay the same 1,000, even at a higher price for Bitcoin, right? And it might actually go up. So I think it's going to look more like this in the next Bitcoin cycle. So, people are saying, well, there's going to be a massive shock. Well, not really. I mean, it'll be entirely demand driven. So I think you can really make the case that mining doesn't matter anymore. Thank you. It'll be entirely demand driven. So I think you can really argue that mining doesn't matter anymore. It's just, especially with these big mainstream trading players coming in, it doesn't really matter anymore, even in Bitcoin terms. All right, so now let's dive into a different hypothesis. Let's talk about the gold hypothesis. Now, when the gold ETF came out in 2004, we didn't see massive inflation, and there wasn't a huge demand for gold. I was involved in gold. I owned gold way back from 1990. 1991. I owned gold. I participated in this gold GLD ETF, right? When it came out, and I can tell you, it was a very different story. It wasn't a 4-year cyclical story. It just kept on going up. So we went from $400 an ounce to $500 to $600 to $800 to $865,000.
Fred Krueger says cycles are changing due to demand from Bitcoin ETFs, BlackRock, and a potential Bitcoin reserve strategy. Having cycles are less crucial now. The 450 Bitcoins still circulating are almost irrelevant compared to these purchases. This all comes from Fred Krueger. He simply says that the cycles are changing massively here because we now have such massive demand from Bitcoin ETFs, from BlackRock and also a potential Bitcoin reserve strategy that the halving cycles are no longer decisive here, because normally we always had the massive influence of the halving cycles. But if so much demand is created here by BlackRock, by Bitcoin ETFs, so much base demand, then the 450 Bitcoin that are simply still coming into circulation here are almost no longer relevant in relation to the blatant purchases. I forgot about MicroStrategy, but of course you have to add MicroStrategy as well. The purchases here are so massive that the payouts from Bitcoin hardly matter anymore. And that's why he clearly says, hey, the cyclicality of Bitcoin is being broken, and we're entering a 7-year supercycle or gigacycle now. And he compares it to the gold ETFs. You can see that very clearly here. He says that where the gold ETFs were introduced, gold also entered a supercycle. So back in 2004, we had a gold price of $405.30 per ounce. Then it went to $518, $608, and so on. It just kept going like that until 2011. Here we had basically rising gold prices. That was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years in a row where the gold price kept going up. So we definitely had a supercycle here. And Fred Krueger sees something similar coming our way because we have such massive demand from BlackRock, from the Bitcoin ETFs, and the whole situation that the halving hardly has any influence anymore. We might see some small pullbacks, maybe 20, 30, or 40% drops, but no more 70% 2-year bear markets. That means that this is definitely Fred Krueger's big statement, and it contradicts VanEck's statement. If Fred Krueger is right here, then the price predictions from VanEck are definitely off. Maybe the 2025 price prediction will still hold up, but after that, the price prediction is going to miss the mark big time because we won't just see some 70% drawdown. Instead, we're going to break out massively. To the upside, if you ask me. I find the idea and the theory really, really interesting. I don't really want to take a position here because, I can't see the future. Of course, this is also a bit of crystal ball reading. One person says this, another says that. I'm relatively open-minded here, but I'm actually more on the side that we're seeing cycles again because we can see that the cycles have always repeated themselves, and of course there are now new factors and so on. I'm really open to whatever comes my way. I'm all in for the super giga hypercycle, but I'm still a bit skeptical. In 2021, if you want to buy Bitcoin now, I'll drop a link below for Bitcoin, the easiest way to buy Bitcoin in Europe. Really super simple, just use the code Bitcoin Hotel and you can still get up to 20% off the fees. If a supercycle does come, then you're definitely well positioned here. Let me know what you think about the two theories. Are you more on the super hyper giga cycle side, or are you more on the conservative side saying that the cycles repeat themselves? See you later. Peace out.